I work as a full-time fire lookout in California. For those who don't know what this is, basically, I live in a tower in the middle of the woods and watch for wildfires. For most of the year, I live in the middle of nowhere with my German Shepherd, Sam. The only contact I have with the outside world is through a radio that connects me to the nearest fire lookout tower, about 70 miles away. That tower has a more powerful radio that connects all the towers in the area, while also being able to contact management and the authorities. I've also got my cell phone, of course, but reception is spotty at best and goes out for hours at a time, making it pretty unreliable. In other words, I'm pretty much on my own out here. That suits me fine. I've always been comfortable in the woods, and I'm not really one for socializing. 90% of the time, I'm left to my own devices. I spend a lot of time hunting with Sam, chopping firewood for my wood-burning stove, and reading. Pretty boring, yeah, but it was enough for me. It was quiet and peaceful, and really, that's all I want. Towards the end of my last stint out there, though, it wasn't as quiet. This happened in the weeks before I left to take some time off back home. I started noticing it was off maybe a week before all this really started. It was small things at first. I noticed that come sunset, the forest got unusually quiet. The usual sound of birds and wildlife would die out. It wouldn't go completely silent, mind you, just quieter than usual. I remember the crickets though. They never stopped making noise, even when things took off. Then I noticed the weird tracks in the dirt or markings on trees in the morning. Nothing really out of the ordinary here. I figured it was probably some animal or maybe a backpacker hiking through the woods. Happens sometimes, but usually I at least notice if someone is around. It was hard to make out what made the tracks. Whatever it was dragged its feet, which makes the tracks a lot harder to identify, at least for me. The weirdest thing though happened the night before this all really started. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and I was up reading some mystery novel and drinking a couple beers. Sam was laying at the foot of my cot up in the tower, as he did most nights. I remember hearing a weird noise outside. Not that weird, it's the woods. Strange noises happen all the time. I would have just ignored it and gone back to reading, if it weren't for Sam's reaction. Normally, when he hears anything going on outside, he's up at the door right away, growling and ready to attack whatever it was. I'd have to quiet him down with a treat or something, and then he'd calm down and go back to laying on my bed or the floor next to it. That wasn't what happened this time though. I remember hearing the noise, like a yelp from a wolf or coyote or something, but deeper. Being used to the usual procedure, I was prepared to sit up to calm the dog down from his inevitable panic attack when I set my book down and saw what he was doing. He didn't move from the bed, but his head jerked up from where it rested and his paws and ears perked up. He stared straight at the door like he was listening for something, but he didn't make a sound. No sound whatsoever. I could swear it looked like he was holding his breath, but I figured that's just my mind playing up the situation. Regardless, that reaction was something I'd never seen from him before. I remember a cold feeling running down my spine when I saw him, followed by a sense of dread I couldn't really explain. I sat up in bed and pulled on my boots. The dog didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my movement. He just stared right at the door. My tower is basically a cabin with wall-to-wall windows on all sides, built on a platform raised up about 30 feet. There's a catwalk and wood railing surrounding the cabin as well, so I can stand out on the balcony of sorts and look out across the forest with my binoculars. It took a moment to look out the window to see if I could see anything out on the balcony. When I didn't see anything, I decided to step outside to take a look down at the woods. I grabbed my rifle on the way out of the door, an old Lee Enfield I used mostly for hunting. I figured if it was a wolf or something, it would be best to be armed, just in case. The dog didn't follow me outside. He was still just staring at the door on my bed. It was really starting to creep me out. I stood out on the catwalk for a few minutes and looked down at the forest below the tower. Nothing seemed to be in the little clearing the tower was built in, so I figured whatever was out there had moved on. It was when I started to go back inside when I first saw them. I had no idea what the hell I was seeing. It came with a sort of wheezing yelp. Hard to describe. Kind of like someone had the wind knocked out of them and screamed at the same time. It was an unsettling noise that came with the appearance of a bright yellow light in the woods below. It was like someone had lit one of those electrical lanterns. More noises sounded out, echoing the first cry. A new light followed with each noise until the woods surrounding the tower were lit up like someone had turned on a set of spotlights surrounding me. I heard the scrambling of claws on the wooden floor and looked back to see Sam finally moving. He jumped off the bed, only to crawl underneath it and huddle up against the wall of the cabin. Still quiet, but clearly terrified now. I turned back to look down at the trees, and that's when I felt like I should have been following Sam's lead. They came out of the tree line and entered the clearing one by one. I couldn't get a great look from where I was, but I could make out humanoid shapes walking toward the tower. They dragged their feet as they moved, kind of like a zombie or something. I stared down at them in some kind of trance. I was paralyzed by fear at this point. Light spilled out of them. It was like there were holes in their bodies, and something inside of them was radiating outward to illuminate the surroundings. I couldn't make out their faces or finer details. I thought they were coming from me. I was terrified of what they were doing. I wanted to run inside and lock the door and hide under the bed with Sam. It didn't even cross my mind to fire the rifle. It hung limply at my side in my loose grip. When they were barely a few feet away from my tower, I thought they were going to start coming up the stairs to my cabin when one of them turned out of nowhere. It faced the outhouse that served as my bathroom. The tiny building had an electrical lamp over the door to light it up at night, and the automatic timer that flipped it on had just gone off. The thing let out a wheeze that the others seemed to respond to, and suddenly they all bolted forward to surround the outhouse. They moved with terrifying speed, but it wasn't a sprint or jog. They jerked forward as if they were being pulled along by some outside force. They threw themselves forward, flailing their limbs and jerking their heads back and forth as they moved so fast that it felt like they were at the outhouse 20 yards away in barely a couple seconds. They crowded underneath the light and stared up at it. Wheezes of what I can only describe as pleasure sounding out from the crowd. I was able to count out 6 of them as a light illuminated their forms. Previously, the lights coming from their bodies served to obscure them, like how the headlights of a car makes it hard to see the driver when it's coming at you at night. Now I could see them in all their terrifying glory. They looked almost human. Pale white skin, interrupted by what looks like slash wounds where the light spilled out of them. The skin around these slashes looked like it was burnt black. They were all naked, but I couldn't make out any signs of extremities on them. They faced away from me, so I couldn't see their faces. At least, until one of them turned. For maybe a minute, they huddled underneath the light of the outhouse and made their wheezing noises. It was like moths to a flame. They seemed obsessed with the light. Then, one of them turned around and looked straight up at me. We locked eyes, and the most overwhelming sense of terror I've ever felt washed over me. Its eyes were massive, as big and round as baseballs, and pure black. They shone in the light of the outhouse as they stared up at me. I'd never seen anything like it. All of a sudden, the light bulb in the outhouse burst with a loud pop. But just before it did, I could have sworn the thing smiled up at me. A big, toothless grin that pulled a cry of terror out of its throat as the outhouse light went out. Right when the light went out, so did the monsters. In an instant, the forest below was bathed in darkness again, and it seemed like the things just vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring down at the outhouse they'd been huddling against for what felt like hours. My eyes searched for any sign of the creatures, but the dark building was silent and unmoving. They were gone. I didn't break out of my fear-induced paralysis until I felt Sam press his snout against my hand that still held my rifle. He crawled out from under the bed at some point and walked up to me. I jumped out of my trance and looked down at the dog, and he looked back up at me, curiously. No sign of fear from him, like nothing had even happened to scare him. That's when I was finally able to relax a little. Still horror-struck, but at least I was able to move again. I went back inside with the dog and locked the door, shaking with fear and adrenaline. I didn't sleep that night. Who could after something like that? I just sat in my bed with my back against the wall with Sam and stared out the window into the night sky until sunrise. When the sunlight finally came, I felt a wave of calm wash over me and the fear finally start to ebb away. I couldn't explain why, but the daylight felt like the last bit of light that was safe for me now. This wasn't the last time I encountered these things, just the first. I came to call them the woodlights after a while, when it became clear this wasn't a freak incident. Seemed appropriate. To be honest, I have a hard time believing any of this, and I was the one it happened to. I can promise you, this is real though. Whatever this is. These things are out there, lurking in the darkness and chasing the light. I don't know what they are, where they've come from, or why they're only revealing themselves now, but the fact of the matter is, they are. That's why I'm telling this. People need to know that these things live out there. They need to know so they can be prepared if they ever see them. Even if none of you believe this story, at least I tried to warn you. For those of you who want to know more, I'll leave all of you with this piece of advice. Stay out of the woods at night. If you can't stay out of the woods, stay out of the light. And if you can't stay out of the light, pray to whatever God you believe in that they do not find you.